Welcome, everyone. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here. General Brent Scowcroft defines strategy as where do you want to go and how do you want to get there? And I think the main goal of this Cyber Risk Wednesday, underwritten by Raytheon, is to look at the strategies that various elements of the U.S. government has produced on cyber and try to come to some sense of how they might most effectively be operationalized through cyber policies and implementing activities. There was a DoD cyber strategy and a White House national cyber strategy released last year. They build on existing strategies, but also propose some new approaches. For example, in the national strategies focus on shared responsibility, and the DoD strategies, innovation on defending forward, as just two examples. And so in a very dynamic and complex landscape in every way, it's these types of documents that really, certainly in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, that we really think are vital as how to execute these strategies in a way that makes them real, that achieves the uppermost level goals and outcomes that we're seeking. That's really the focus. That's the purpose of a strategy document. Yet there are some questions that are unanswered in terms of how different government entities can breathe life into these documents, how to operationalize them, how and where various efforts can connect for most effect, and really what is sort of various forms of interagency collaboration in this space look like. We're certainly asking these questions because at the Scowcroft Center, we work to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important challenges that the United States and its allies face in the world. The center honors General Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security and support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Our Cyber Statecraft initiative takes the best of that and applies it to the nexus of geopolitics, national security, and cyberspace, focusing very significantly on relevant and actionable solutions to try to prevent crises and also work toward other major goals. And so we have a really great panel today that's ready to grapple with all of these issues. The lineup includes Mr. Jay Healy, who is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He's also a non-resident senior fellow for our Cyber Statecraft initiative. But the highlight of his career, which will never be surpassed, was when he was the founding director of the Cyber Statecraft initiative. We also have Ms. Madeline Mortelmans, who is the principal director for cybersecurity in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and we greatly appreciate her taking her valuable time to come here. Today, we have Rear Admiral Bill Lair, retired admiral from the U.S. Navy, who is the director of the Department of Defense cyber warfare programs at Raytheon Intelligence, Information, and Services. They'll be moderated by Scowcroft Center U.S. Navy Senior Fellow Commander Joshua Vergau, who is a cryptologic warfare officer for the U.S. Navy when he's not here. We're also very thrilled at the presence of board directors here and for all of you to come and offer your time, and we'll be looking to you for your questions as well as this event proceeds. This event will be webcast live, and it is on the record. Please join the conversation on Twitter by tweeting at CyberStatecraft with the hashtag CyberRiskWednesday. And with our panelists on stage, I'm sure that today's discussion will be very illuminating. And now I'll ask our panelists to come up and for Commander Vergau to start the conversation. Thank
you. Okay. Thank you, Barry, for the introduction and some context to what we'll be talking about today. As Barry alluded to, 2018 was kind of a banner year for cyber strategy. As you alluded to, the White House published their national cyber strategy, kind of putting out the overall framework for strategy for the government. DoD put out their own DoD cyber strategy, and even DHS put out their own cybersecurity strategy as well. Now that's a lot of strategy for one domain in the course of 1 year. Certainly a lot of strategy for anybody who's a stakeholder in a domain to try to digest, but clearly it's a lot to digest if you're in the position to try to implement these strategies or try to operationalize them. And luckily enough, we have these panelists who are going to help us work through that. Real quick on how the format is going to go, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to provide some opening remarks and some insight from their perspectives. We're then going to transition over for a moderated discussion to kind of explore some of the issues, and then we'll save some time at the end for a moderated Q&A with the audience. So without further ado, Admiral, you want to start, please?
Sure, Josh. Thank you. So first, I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for the partnership we've had with Raytheon. It's been, I think, very productive for both of us, and to be able to come talk about operationalizing these strategies today is a real treat for me. You know, I started 10 years ago in really at the very beginning, before there was a cyber command, and the working group that led to the stand up in the services, and so I think the realization of finally a really grown-up strategy on the DoD side that is, I think, in total lockstep with a national strategy, for me, shows the maturity of where we've come in the last 8 or 9 years. And then I think if I reflect on where the forces are, because I kind of left the stage on the Navy side as the cyber mission force was being created. But they were just people with not really a lot of doctrine, not a lot of TTP. So what is it that's going to be able to take this strategy, which is a roadmap, and make it real? And I think the commander put down a great template last week in his testimony to Congress. And General Nakasone really laid out 5 things that I think are show the force of which he's taking this group forward. And the first is, where does the cyber mission force fit in this great power competition? They've got to be a strategic force, and they've got to be understood the way that an Air Force is, a Naval Force is. So there's a piece in this great power, strategic competition. A warfighting ethos, and I think this is going to be one of the things that sets this force apart. Is how do they play in the same sandbox with every other warfighter across all the services, and yet do the things that they need to have their service identities. They've got to be a ready force, and this is something that I spend a lot of time now in my position at Raytheon, thinking about how this force becomes more ready, well equipped, and able to do the things the nation needs them to do. There's a big issue with partnerships. I think cyber is unique in that the partnerships that we have, particularly with the private sector, who owns and operates most of the internet and most of the fabric, is particularly important. I think we have a long ways to go on the partnerships of the allied ways, so I think that is a great thing. And then the last thing is really the operating infrastructure. How do you equip this force? So looking at each of those, I think the first thing is cyber information age technologies have an impact of all operating forces in DoD. For me, General Fogarty at our cyber says it best. We cannot fight the Army that we have bought if cyber isn't secure and cyber isn't working well. And I think that is going to be one of the keys to success from not just the cyber mission force, but the entire force as we go forward in this great power competition. Cyber has an impact on everything that we do. It's going to have an impact on force structure and modernization of C2. And I'll give you an example from a naval officer's perspective. The CNO talks about a 355 ship Navy. A 355 ship Navy that is 1/3 unmanned is a very different force from a cyber perspective than if we consider that all of those ships are manned in a model that's traditional with what I grew up as a Cold Warrior and really through this decade. So it's going to be different like that. And I think that Cyber Mission Force is going to have to tackle that. It may not be the most pressing thing. I think the warfighter ethos and readiness are probably the 2 most pressing things. The CMF has a couple of primary considerations. One is how they define and talk about operational risk with the other warfighting communities, the platform communities. And it's, really understanding what that is. And you go back to General Fogarty's words about fighting the Army that we bought, fighting the Navy that we bought, and platform operators deal with risk day in and day out in a very evolved way. And I think part of getting this warfighting ethos is understanding what that risk is from a cyber point of view. And the second is, this idea that I think General Nakasone draws out really well in the Joint Forces quarterly article about persistent engagement in cyberspace. And that's something that we're going to have to practice and get good at. It isn't going to happen overnight. I think our legacy in cyber operations that comes from intelligence operations is going to be quite different in how we think about that. The MOP is different. If you're collecting intelligence, it's collect good intelligence and don't get caught. If you're acting as a warfighter, the attribution might not be the first thing on the list. So there's going to be a lot of things there. And the quote from the Joint Forces article is worth thinking about. Persistent engagement of our adversaries cannot be successful if actions are limited to DoD networks. You have to be forward. And for a Cold Warrior, that means a lot. Our forces must operate against our enemies in their virtual territory. So I think that it's a great way to start to do that. There are going to be differences that have to get worked through. It's not really akin to how I thought about freedom of navigation on the seas, but we're going to have to find a model that we're comfortable here from a policy and an engagement point of view to be able to do that. The third is readiness, and readiness is, I think what will set the force able to be a great partner with all the other combatant commanders. Readiness starts with doctrine. It's carried on with tactics, techniques, and procedures that really lead to good requirements for the systems the cyber mission force needs. Then it's supported by training and rehearsal and exercises. After that comes inspections and combat certification. We haven't talked about these things nearly enough as a ready cyber force. I mean, what's it mean to be combat certified to support a combatant commander, the same way that we would think about it for an air wing that's going to deploy or a brigade that's going to deploy. And there's got to be this synergy between an understanding in the cyber mission force itself between offensive cyber operations and defensive cyber operations. All of this is going to come, and then the last piece of readiness is going to be how do we blend it with the platform-based operational forces to be able to do that. The fourth thing was the partnerships, and partnerships I think take three different pieces, and the first is how we do it across government. I already remarked that I think the national cyber strategy set a great framework. It set the importance of cyberspace, cyber capabilities, information age, leadership in the importance to our way of life. And then I think the DoD strategy has come behind that and really set a way to think about it in a very grown-up way that honestly, 7 or 8 years ago when we were standing up the cyber mission force, we didn't have that. We had a couple of really simple ideas. The fast, cheap way to do it was to partner with NSA. That's where I was told to start with. And now I think we have a very mature strategy to go with. The second's with our allies, and I'm not satisfied that we're really putting enough thinking into how we are evolving our cyber planning with our allies. And it happens at 2 or 3 levels. The first is, and I'll use a Raytheon example, we have a lot of FMS cases for different military hardware, but cyber is rarely
FMS?
included. FMS cases, yeah.
You might need to explain.
Sorry, Jay, foreign military sales. So in a foreign military sales case, cyber is rarely accounted for in the cybersecurity. But I think if you're a cyber professional, you acknowledge very quickly that every time you open up a piece of software, every time you open up a network to a partner, there's shared risk. And we have to think through what that means. And we have to bring that into, I think, meaningful joint exercises with our allies as we do that. And the last is industry, and I hope Jay talks about this because I think he's very articulate about it, but we have to recognize the role that private industry has in cyber defense for not just our nation, but for DoD as well. And that, I think, is going to be an important partnership that Cyber Command learns to take advantage of in the coming years. And the last is, how do we equip this operational force? And we created the Cyber Mission Force, we created the command structure, but they came as they were. So the IT guys brought a little bit of defensive capability, the offensive guys brought their intelligence tradecraft, but there was really nothing that allows them to scale, and certainly nothing that allowed them to probably even think rationally about what they need to be prepared for in a great power competition. So General Nakasone talked about 5 things in his testimony. One was a common firing platform. That resonates, I think, with anyone on the platform side. A couple of programs that are unified platform and joint cyber command and control. He talked about a more well-defined defined sensor network, and he talked about underpinning that all with something called persistent cyber training environment. And that is, again, I believe, goes hand in hand with a readiness. If you have, that's the basis of systems that is also with a foundational training system, a foundational rehearsal environment. It really is going to allow this force to flourish and be a great partner across the force. So that's how I think on the DoD side we get to an operational capability and operationalize the strategy that's been set forth. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation over the next couple of hours. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Admiral. Madeline, would you go, please?
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me today. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to talk about our strategy and to join my colleagues here. I'm going to touch on 2 main ideas. The first is the national security imperative. What's driving the need for strong, coordinated, national-level cyber strategy? And the second, about the DoD approach and what's changed in terms of how we are thinking about what the Department of Defense must be capable of and what that means in terms of implications for implementation. So maybe in talking at Cyber Risk Wednesday, describing the national security imperative might seem redundantly repetitive, but I think that is one of the key ideas. The idea that the open, reliable access to the internet and information is not a new idea. The importance of this has been around for a long time. In fact, the last national cyber strategy, which was published in 2003, that was core to what that strategy articulated. To put that strategy in reference, the last time we had a national strategy, 2003, the iPhone didn't come out till 2007. My favorite internet innovation, Amazon Prime, wasn't until 2005. So we're talking about a lot of progress since then. The most significant thing that we have seen in terms of the change of what we understand is the change in the growing severity of the threat. It is absolutely central to our understanding. We are seeing our adversaries increasing the scope and the pace of the use of the cyber domain for competition, using coordinated campaigns intended to achieve asymmetric advantage across the spectrum of conflict. So before operations, day-to-day competition, all the way through to posturing to fight and win and achieve their national outcomes in a military competition. This is kind of the key idea. We measure risk in the Department of Defense in terms of threat, vulnerability, and impact or consequence. Right? The vulnerabilities are proliferating as we proliferate things that are connected. Just in terms of sheer number, regardless of how woke we are to the cyber threat, the more things they are, the more doors there are that are potentially vulnerable. And in terms of impact, we're moving more and more things into the digital domain, making them part of the risk calculus. But ultimately, it's that threat factor, that change of seeing our adversaries seeking to exploit the domain for their advantage that's really changing how we're thinking about the risk. And that change in risk requires a change in how we're confronting the threat. Cyber defense is necessary but no longer sufficient. That's the key message here. And in order to do that, to address that, it requires a more proactive and comprehensive approach. The urgency for a national and coordinated approach, both at the national security level as well as the department level, is because cyber challenges our understanding of national security issues. It challenges roles and responsibilities. In terms of threats can move through cyberspace from our terminology of red to blue to gray, red to gray to blue, right? It can cross borders easily. There's that free flow of information that we value, but that also allows the free flow of threats. It exceeds any single department or agency's roles and responsibilities, capacity, and authority. Most of the organizations, even the newest, DHS, was stood up long before we had a full and mature understanding of the cyber threat. And so we're having to figure out how we fit together a coordinated, clear playbook with national level objectives, and then supporting strategies that articulate underneath that framework how each of us are going to accomplish those objectives is critical to actually operationalizing a whole of government national approach to address this national level threat. So that takes us to the Department of Defense and what we believe needs to be done. With the 2018 DoD strategy, we actually broke our normal kind of battle rhythm of producing a new strategy every 4 years and went with something new in 3 years. Our last strategy was released in April of 2015. And the reason that we looked at making that change because of the threat was a recognition that we had to modernize and update our approach in this new threat environment. The overarching idea, my tagline, is breaking cyber out of the geek ghetto. The idea is that cyber is an urgent and pressing problem for the Department of Defense and a pressing opportunity that can no longer be left in the CIO channels, in the channels of the tech geeks, only to be addressed or considered by our individuals at Cyber Command. This is a strategy for the department. This is a strategy not just for the cyber mission force and for the CIOs. This is a mission statement for all of the department that articulates in the 21st century what we must be capable of in order to fight and win the nation's wars, and recognizing the role that cyber will play in that going forward. So in that context, it also addresses our evolution of understanding of what is required to succeed. The what, the how, the who, the when. So a few examples. I believe there was most of you have probably read the strategy or at least seen the primer of the kind of key 5 objectives that we need to accomplish. But a couple of examples about how things have changed. So first, it articulates that the joint force has to be able to operate in a contested environment. This is a fundamental shift from the idea that we have to just defend our networks to moving to the idea that this is a contested domain, that we have to have the ability to fight and win the nation's wars while we're fighting in the cyber domain. Those things that we rely on are not going to assuredly be there. So we have to be ready for that contingency. We have to be prepared. It also expands the sense of what those things are. It's not just networks. Right? It's not just the computers, it's the information, it's the systems. It's not just our weapon systems, it's industrial control systems and critical infrastructure. It updates that thinking about what we need to do to succeed. Another example is in terms of critical infrastructure. Many of our previous strategies talked about DoD having a role in terms of defend the nation. That's a traditional DoD mission. But what does that mean in cyberspace? What do we, as the Department of Defense, bring as a comparative advantage that helps us better defend the nation? And what the 2018 strategy did was drive consensus that we are best postured. Our comparative advantage in this space is by projecting power, defending forward, shaping the environment, and addressing threats before they come to the homeland. And when you look at that, and it seems like a relatively straightforward conclusion that's consistent with what DoD does in all of the other domains, that was not a going-in conclusion. That was something we worked towards to understand our specific role vis-a-vis our department and agency partners and what we can bring best to this national level fight. Another example is DoD information. The recognition that we have to secure it wherever it is. And this idea is about defending the defense industrial base, our future qualitative military edge. not just about fighting and winning today's wars, but ensuring that we can fight and win the nation's wars for the future. We spend billions of dollars of taxpayer money investing in research and development of our future platforms. We cannot allow those to walk out the back door at no cost, providing our advantage to our adversaries. And then finally, it's about partners. If you look at the 2015 strategy very carefully, a lot of it talks about accepting risk while we focus on ourselves. We have to get our own house in order. We got to build our forces. We have to defend our networks. It's us, us, us. Well, the fact of the matter is that this space is shared. Our vulnerabilities are your vulnerabilities, are our partners' vulnerabilities. And if we are going to be successful, we have to recognize that partnerships are key to shared success. And that's domestic partnerships, that's private sector partnerships, and that's international partnerships. So that's the strategy where it shifted us. The other thing that was really significantly different about this is that we conducted a cyber posture review, which was an ambitious assessment, first ever, thanks to Congress directing us to conduct it. We took a look at what we had to actually do to implement that strategy and whether or not we had the forces, the capability, the doctrine, the authorities, the whole suite of things required to accomplish that outcome. The objective was we established an objective baseline of our cyber readiness through extensive research, data collection, interviews, workshops, modeling, war games, and produced hundreds of pages detailing insights that define specific gaps, potential opportunities, refined our operational concepts, and further developed the approach that we articulated. The result provided a roadmap that will guide and provide measures to assess our implementation efforts for years to come. And that's really a significant shift. We all talk about doing lines of effort and checking how well you're doing, but oftentimes if you don't do a baseline, you can say you're doing great, look at all the great stuff I've done. If you don't have anything to compare it to, it's not that useful. So DoD is driving this implementation. We are moving forward, and in less than a year, the 6 or 8 months since the strategy and CPR and the national strategy has come out, we've had some significant successes, and highlighting along the key areas where we thought we had to drive. We've a more lethal force, accelerating and integrating cyber into our capabilities. And a few examples, we're investing more in approaching risk management of our own networks in a new and innovative way. We've got new authorities to allow us to operate consistent with the approach we've described, and we're driving billions of dollars in resource allocation in the program budget review, our own internal rack and stack, to better align to accomplish that outcome. When we talk about strengthening and expanding partnerships, another key outcome, you can highlight since the fall, we signed an agreement between Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Homeland Security that articulates and refines at the Secretary level our understanding of what it means to defend and secure the homeland from cyber threats, that refines each of our roles and responsibilities and how we enable and empower one another to accomplish our missions. We've initiated together with DHS Pathfinder projects with critical infrastructure to enhance information sharing and better protect those sectors. And in terms of our international partners, in October, the Secretary of Defense announced the U.S. commitment to provide offensive cyber in support of NATO operations. We're seeing reformation of the DoD and education of leaders, talking again about this idea of breaking it out of the geek ghetto and informing and driving. You see the secretary, the acting secretary, the deputy secretary spending time on cyber every single week, holding their leaders accountable. In terms of cultivating the workforce and the talent to accomplish the strategy, we've launched the Cyber Accepted Service that will make it easier to recruit, retain, and promote the workforce talent required to actually do the things we said we need to do. And finally, in terms of competing and deterring malicious cyber activity, we are working constantly in terms of operationalizing that approach, both as a Department of Defense and as part of a broader U.S. government in support of the Cyber Deterrence Initiative, strengthening the norms of responsible state behavior. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mel.
Yeah.
Right. Jay, please.
Great. I'm going to pull back. Hey, everyone. It's great to be back on the stage at Atlanta Council. When we started, there was literally a bookcase, and they laid the bookcase down, and that had to pass for the stage when we started all this. I just want to say a little bit on the persistent engagement, because that's what's different. It underpins the strategy, but it isn't the strategy. The strategy it's more of the theory behind the case. This is how current cyber conflict is looking. These are the dynamics, and therefore that leads into the strategy to deal with this. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what the academic theory has been, not necessarily what's doctrine or strategy, but a lot of us, even those that are following us, have said, it's more offense. They want more offense. And well, maybe they do, but it's a lot more subtle than that, right? Some of my colleagues have said it's ABH, always be hacking. And it misses a lot of the subtlety of what's getting in here. Because a lot of this is saying the way that we have tended to think about this is a very traditional American way of thinking about war. It's on or it's off. We're at war or it's at peace. It's episodic. These things happen and you pay attention when it comes up. You call a DC and you said, this thing happened, what do we do about this? And what the strategy and what the theory and where persistent engagement is trying to get in and saying, it's not like that, or it's not always like that. Yes, there might be particular episodes that you care about, WannaCry, not Petya, but you have these forces that are always in contact with one another. In the green when we were talking about like naval operations, like freedom of navigation operations, anti-submarine warfare, right, where you've got these forces that are always in tension. And so you have the old rules of espionage during the Cold War, where you always had this active spy, counter spy. And that's what they're trying to get at with this persistent engagement. So in saying, all right, so what do we need to do differently? What is this administration in particular doing differently with the changes to the White House documents, PPD 20 now becoming a document called NSPM 13, is trying to say, all right, we need to allow this persistent presence, and General Nakasone talks about this, this ability to pivot in gray space. If we see the bad guys, if we're seeing the Russians go here and here and here, we should be able to maybe follow them, even if that's in systems that aren't owned by the United States and the Department of Defense. Maybe they're owned by their allies. That we should try and make that a little bit easier. We can watch what they're doing. That helps us to stop them, even by making changes in our own defenses. It allows us to learn their TTP, their tactics, techniques, procedures, do indications and warnings so that we'll know what's coming next. And General Nakasone also uses the word intercept and halt. And right, that's where most of us get our attention. Oh my God, they want to do more offense. And there can be part of that, right? If you see they have command and control infrastructure, if you see they have malicious software, being able to make the changes in that before they are able to use it or able to use it fully. And in this way, directly degrading their capability to act against the United States, the US. And so that's a fair part of this, right? Especially in the academic, the word friction comes up a lot, imposing friction on the other side so it is harder for them to do what they want. To disrupt their operations, like their command and control infrastructure, so that they are having to rebuild their own infrastructure. They're having to worry about defense of themselves, and therefore they've got less ability to come at us. Right? This part of it is not about deterrence. It's not about signaling. Right? It's out there to directly stop operations and disrupt them and counter. And a lot of them in the DoD strategy, they tend to sometimes use the word counter as part of this. And we're still working through the strategy as it comes out. And General Nakasone talks about, his Peace and Joint Forces Quarterly. Excellent piece where he talks this through. That's separate from deterrence. That's separate from offensive cyber operations. Offensive cyber operations, yes, absolutely against ISIS. He talks about JTF Ares and these other operations we're doing. That's best thought of as operations. There's other bits that we can definitely call deterrence, right? If we were deterred in 2016, General Clapper, Ben Rhodes have both said the decision calculus within The sit room changed because we were concerned about an escalatory path where the Russians might affect our electrical grid. Clapper said that. And Ben Rhodes wrote that we were worried that instead of just doing soft stuff on the election, that they might try something harder against the actual electoral systems, according to Ben Rhodes. That's that spot of deterrence, right? That's saying, well, if the Russians are going to hold our electrical grid at risk, let's hold their electrical grid at risk. So that way, we've got something that they value, or not even the electrical grid, something else that they value. There are parts of this in the strategy, but it doesn't feature as much as it does from the White House. If you think the strategy is based on what John Bolton says, you come up with a very different view. It has confused a lot of us, whether that's in the think tank and academia. It hasn't fooled the journalists, but it might have fooled your headline writers, who are pushing this is offense, offense, offense. So what are our adversaries going to think the actual strategy is? Is it going to be this very, very subtle thing that General Nakasone and the Department of Defense are saying? It's this quiet way that we're going to, one of the terms from the academics is it's tacit bargaining. We're going to figure out what the norms are because we're in this back and forth, and when things get kind of out of control, we're going to bring it back. In the terms of academic terms, it's negative feedback. Right, that as we dust it up with each other, it's going to come back to historic norms as we get in there and we mix it up with each other and we bring ourselves back to norms. And that's absolutely possible. It's very subtle, but it could absolutely work that way. It's less likely to work that way when you have others that are saying this is absolutely about offense. This is absolutely, the handcuffs are off. We're going to get in there, and they're going to feel our power. And so at the end of the day, a lot of the strategy, it's on one hand saying, we want, this is going to be stabilizing. By reducing the operational constraints on our cyber forces, this is going to be stabilizing. This is going to be better for the United States. This is going to be better for the internet because competition and conflict will have a lid on it. But the United States also says the point of the strategy is superiority and overmatch. And sometimes you can't have both, right? It's very DoD, it's very US in some ways to say we want both. What's the best way to have nuclear stability? Have the best nuclear force. Boom, there's no trade-off. But what we're talking about here, right, when we're talking about pivoting through gray space, we're talking about networks that are owned by others for their own purpose. We're talking about pivoting through British Telecom and Deutsche Telekom. We're talking about systems that are owned by global companies that are now underpinning our society, our economy. So when we're talking about normalizing and making this like other force, we have these very significant differences. You might not be able, even if it's an operational imperative, the used word by the academics and to some degree maybe in the strategy, it's an operational imperative, you must do this. Even if that is true, it still might lead to worse national security outcomes. And I'll dance off on, if you were, I was in the Air Force, but if you were in the Army, right, it might be an operational imperative if you want to win firefights to bring as much firepower to bear. And that is the right manner of force employment to win a battle. That might not be the right answer if you're in a counterinsurgency. And you don't have a direct positive correlation between firepower and the outcomes that you want. It might be a negative outcome because too many people are caught up. And that's, so I love the strategy. I love this thinking behind it. It is in the 20 years that I've been doing this, to me, this is the most fundamental change that I've seen. This very clear-eyed sense of what's different and what we need to do about it. But it's these long-term implications. How does this affect the rest of us? Is this really going to be negative feedback, or will it be positive feedback? And it drives everyone away from the norms. And right now, we're in the position of having to chase those big answers after the strategy is already out there.
Thank you so much. We could take this direction about a million different ways right now. A lot of points were made, but I want to start with this. When I consider kind of operationalizing a strategy or operationalizing kind of anything, there's like a sense, it feels like there's a sense of urgency about it. On both the national strategy and the DoD strategy, there's a long kind of to-do list in there, and each of these components, either it's a pillar in the national strategy or objective in the DoD one, each of those seems like a pretty heavy lift. From each of your perspective, what are those efforts that you think the DoD or the nation should be doing today? We should be focusing on right now versus efforts that could maybe be considered long-term and maybe don't have the same sense of urgency we need to tackle right now. Madeline, you want to start?
Sure. I have to admit, I don't know that I can give you a single answer. I'm torn. So on one hand, I want the workforce, right, as a priority effort, because ultimately, if you don't have the right people, you're not going to be able to implement and drive the vision of the truly ambitious vision that we have articulated. On the other hand, we've neglected our partners and haven't built the range of partnerships that we truly need to address this shared space. But in the middle, I think our view is that we need to buy some time to allow a lot of these things to develop, and that requires some step up in our effort in terms of day-to-day competition and contesting the malicious cyber activity that we're seeing today that is over the long term degrading U.S. national advantage. So I'd like to be able to build partnerships and build a workforce, but if we don't buy some time to succeed overall, we're going to be that much more worse off.
Yeah. Darryl, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I'll go back to the readiness thing, Josh. And maybe a little bit different spin here. Because I talked about at the individual cyber mission force and the things that are there. I think there's a real need to have a different kind of dialogue at the combatant commander level for those combatant commands that General Nakasone is supporting. So there is a more mature understanding of how cyber forces are going to be engaged. On the defensive side today, it is, I look at the employment of the cyber protection teams, and they're not really doing anything different than they were, 5 years ago when we birthed them. On the offensive side, I've heard senior JTF commanders say, well, I'm really not depending on cyber because I don't know how it's going to work for me, and I'm not sure that I'll ever have command and control of it to plan. And I think that discussion needs to change, and it's a very important part at the top part of the strategy, and without that, I don't think you can get to some of this fundamental readiness that I desire for the force itself.
Jay,
yeah,
comments on priorities?
Yeah, 3 things. One is I'm very concerned about the long-term dynamics of this, about whether it's going to intensify or escalate, make things worse. When it comes to election interference, screw that, right? Number 1 priority, let's stay on that, and let's stay on the Russians. So without a doubt, to me, that's on the right track. 2 is stuff that I would have liked if I were back at the White House. What I would have wanted to see before we implemented this, and maybe this is going on in the background, but going to Cyber Command and also D&D and saying, all right, you say this is going to make things better over time. How are we going to measure that? How are we going to know if indeed this is working as you say, and under what timeline should we expect that? Is this going to take 6 months? Is this going to take a year? Is this going to take 2 years? Because I don't want us to be in another forever war like Afghanistan, right? How many times have we had 3 stars on this stage coming in from Iraq or Afghanistan to say, we're turning the corner. We're about there, just stay with us. We've got the right strategy. We just need to apply it with a little more force. We need a few more Marines, a few more soldiers, and we're gonna get there. Trust us. And so I believe this. This is absolutely a worthy experiment. This is a fantastic experiment, but it's an experiment. When someone says, if we do this, the enemy will back down. If someone says, if we do this, the enemy will step up. Neither one of us has hardly a shred of evidence to support that. At the tactical level, at the level of engagement, we did this, we won this engagement, sure. But at what's going to happen over weeks, over months, years, decades, because this is indefinite, right? This is even more indefinite than counterterrorism. There is no end to this. The normal way of wars is we send the GIs and the war's over, they come back. That does not happen here. The military forces will be in active engagement with the cyber forces of nuclear armed powers forever. And when I say forever, I mean almost legitimately forever, as long as there's humans and there's a cyberspace. So we really need that. Last is, I'm interested, for me, what makes cyberspace most different isn't the persistent engagement or speed of light or close proximity to strategic sources of power, things that General Nakasone rightly points out are critical. To me, it's the role of the private sector. And to me, the private sector is the supported command, not the supporting command. So in future, I would like to look at the persistent engagement and what this means for the private sector and how we can bring in the private sector, or how the military can support the private sector. Because we're not going to make cyberspace secure through persistent presence. Maybe it's going to help. But I'm concerned that this town is going to get so great, military's got this. We've got the cyber mission force. They're going to handle this, and we're going to persistent presence our way out of this. Because we can do that sometimes. You know, we just look at the military, and that's going to be the great answer. That's going to solve everything. Build a wall, and they might not be able to do everything, and so we need to look at that. Thanks.
I'm wondering, one point you made was that no one can say for certain how another state will act, either when you either project power or you present your defensive posture. I wonder, from your perspective, what does that do to policymakers, you think? Because we don't know how the adversary is going to react, how do you think that hinders or helps how the DoD or the nation creates policy on how to act in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, it means that we have to be cautious. We have to have our eyes open. We have to be clear about what the cause and effect is going to be. We have to be open-eyed about what the adversary thinks that we've done. Right? I mean, at very senior levels, I've heard 3 stars and others say, well, we're the only ones that are respecting norms. We're the only ones that are showing any restraint. Absolutely true when it comes to what we call Title 10, warfighting military activity. But if you expand that out to intelligence gathering, if you expand it out to covert action, if you expand it out to presumed US support for the digital overthrow of other nations during the Arab Spring, Green Revolution, Panama Papers, then our adversaries are sure we're heading back and not hitting them first. Yet that is out of the scope of what we consider. So I think, and this is part of our job in academia and think tank, to go in and say, all right, if we are basing it on these things, then the mechanics might not work the way you think, and we have to hope that we have to be good on our side about being able to assess that and deliver that message in a way that's useful for the policymakers.
Any comment on that?
No, I agree with Jay completely here, and it is part of what I call getting good at what we're doing, and there's a huge difference in how we have matured cyber from both the offensive side and the defensive side, but just to use the offensive side, on the intelligence collection side, it was collect good intelligence and don't get caught. And don't get caught was the most important thing, to prevent attribution, because it definitely was espionage. I don't think it's a lot different. You and I were talking about that about Cuckoo's egg, right? Cuckoo's egg, yeah. So, if you've never read Cuckoo's Egg, you could go read a great contemporary example that was written in 1995 about cybersecurity. There's a joke in there, right? It hasn't changed enough that someone who just fell asleep in 1995 wouldn't recognize cybersecurity today.
Can I follow up on that? I'm sorry. And it reminds me of something. I was rereading my Huntington because I'm looking at civ-mil relations right now, and he pointed out one reason why the military mind is so focused on reading military history is because tactics change all of the time, but strategy doesn't. And we've been so caught up in following, oh my God, this new technology, what's this going to mean, that we've lost this going back and reading what the history is going to be and say what has been consistent through this, or relatively consistent. It's a great point.
I think that's an excellent point, and that's a big part of why we're driving cyber out of the geek ghetto, because we don't have to solve problems solely in the cyber domain or solely with cyber expertise, but instead being able to leverage lessons. We've competed before, we have contested before, we have faced challenges before, and to the extent to which we can leverage that experience and that expertise, right? We may not understand specifically how a dynamic or a paradigm may play out in terms of cyber escalation, cyber on cyber, but we have some very thoughtful insights about how our adversaries respond to things, and leveraging that is absolutely something that we do. When you look at the number of interviews, the amount of data we collected, we in fact used a wide range of sources in order to help inform the shaping of the strategic approach. I also just wanted to pull one point you made about the private sector and just really foot stomp that in terms of what the expectations of the government, and in particular the Department of Defense, should be, right? The Department of Defense was established to fight and win the nation's wars, and that's absolutely what we should be doing. And while cyber is a national level threat, when you look at the types of incidents that we have faced in recent years, those are not advanced persistent threat nation state level challenges. We're talking about known vulnerabilities with known patches that have existed for years. And you want to use the hundreds of billions of dollars you invest in developing exquisite capability in the Department of Defense for something that a company should be doing. And I'm not trying to victim blame by any stretch, but until we have that conversation about roles and responsibilities, about what should be expected of the private sector when they have your personal information, when they're dealing with your business, when they're providing you a service, we cannot look to the Department of Defense to be the panacea. This isn't a cyber moonshot. We're not solving. Again, as you mentioned, we know what we need to do. We've known since the 90s. We've got to do it. And then save the DoD, the very expensive, exquisite capability for that exquisite and challenging set of problems.
Yeah. Great point.
And we've been there. I mean, and you know, it's. I was fortunate enough to have a really great boss at 10th Fleet when we stood it up, but he was a surface nuke, was an air defense guy that understood Aegis. So I always had to describe things to Barry in terms of analogies. But here I go all the way back to the 30s. I mean, you had those first men and women who are responsible for building the air power that we have today in the United States. They had the same adventurous kind of spirit that we talk about hackers today. So there's some commonality there. They would try anything. I mean, I just finished reading Last of the Tin Can Sailors, and there was, one of the commanders, it talked about his early days in naval aviation, and it said his face had flattened out from hitting the front of the cockpit so many times on aborted landings in the Sound down in Norfolk, and that's risk, though, that we don't necessarily have a good way to take from that physical world of early aviation, where I think there are a lot of parallels to a virtual world in cyber, and I think it's the practice that we will get, but it's close enough, and I think that adventurous spirit will be a great guide for this cyber mission.
And one of the concerns that bugs me, Bill, and I agree with you, right? I agree with everything you said. But if you talk to Americans in the 20s and 30s and you said, what is America's maritime power? The answer you got back might have been America's merchant seamen, right? The folks that are out there and they're sailing American flagships and American-built vessels bringing our goods to the world. Now, if you ask that kind of question, everyone's going to say the Navy. And so what's our cyber power? At the end of the day, what is America's cyber power? And I'm concerned that answer in DC is going to continue to be, it's located at Fort Meade. And instead of saying it is located in the companies, the individuals that are building and maintaining cyberspace and filling it with content that the world works.
But not to keep preaching air power to an airman, because that's probably a dangerous thing for me to do. But if you go back again to that period in the 30s, and the first thing that I use as an example, the back cover of the 1941 Army-Navy program had a picture of a battleship with a caption, that said a battleship has never been sunk by an aircraft. 7 or 8 days before
Yes.
Pearl Harbor, right? And so, you know, but even if you go back there, all of the contemporary language that was used around air power borrowed the language from artillery.
Yeah.
Or naval bombardment. And I think we're kind of at that same point right now. And I would get, you know, asked the question often, you know, especially back in the early days of Cyber Command and 10th Fleet. So when is cyber going to be able to do something that's mature and adding to the joint fight? And I would always say that's like asking Billy Mitchell or Abram Moffett what the Battle of Midway was going to look like in 1938. They could not have given that description. They could have pontificated about it, but it was well beyond the imagination just 3 or 4 years before that.
I think you're right. We're certainly learning and evolving, but to the point that you made about the advantage and the importance of the private sector in this community, one place where we need to work very hard and very quickly is enabling with the insights that we have to make sure that the private sector has the advantage of the best information together with our partners in DHS. That's really that whole of government imperative to ensure that each of us is playing our proper role in that space to create an integrated effort so that the economic advantage and the national security advantage that we get from the digital domain, we can continue to enjoy that benefit. And that requires each of us to play our role, but also to enable and empower. And that's a big part of DoD's approach, is about enabling and empowering our domestic partners, both our interagency partners and our domestic private sector partners, so that they can be successful in this challenging environment.
And one of the top recommendations I had to that other Atlantic Council Senior Fellow, Tom Bossert, was please, if we've got one priority, let's go through exemplars of a couple different kinds of incidents. Counter DDoS, counter botnet, counter malware, counter APT. Let's take a couple examples of each and then go through in a detailed way, bring in the decision modelers, who took what action or who took what decision based on what information that led to what action and what result. I mean, we really do this through. It's expensive, but only a couple $1 million. It's not that expensive. And we say, who actually was at the critical path of this? Where might we have done better? Where could Cyber Command action have made a difference? Where could a DHS grant or a grant from Google make a difference? And then you use that for your National Cyber Incident Response Plan, because a lot of times we say the private sector owns 90% of cyberspace or 90% of the infrastructure. I bet that they make 90% of the critical decisions that solve most incidents. And so, and to my mind, we have never done that, of actually in a disciplined way have gone through and said, how did we actually make this right? Now, that for the most part, that's not the companies that you mentioned, the victims. This is, you know, the telco providers, the ISPs, the Symantec's, the Microsofts of the world.
Mal, a point you made earlier, and I think it follows up on a point you were just making, Jay, is that when you mentioned, I like the phrase, taking this issue out of the geek ghetto, right? And I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you think taking it out of geek ghetto, do you think there's room for the U.S. and policymakers and folks at Cyber Command to not only be innovative in the technology of cyber, but also begin to be innovative in the diplomacy of cyber or the overall kind of statecraft of communication with other states regarding statecraft? Do you think there's a door opening now for that?
So I think I have a lot of respect for our State Department colleagues who have the overall lead for diplomacy in cyber, and I think kudos to them for the leadership that they've shown over more than a decade in terms of developing not just norms of responsible state behavior, but also operationalizing them with regional confidence building and risk reduction measures. I do believe that in the context of creating common approaches and shared understanding about what role security and defense forces can play in terms of promoting security and stability in cyberspace, there's absolutely a role for DoD to play that is complementary to and supplementary to the diplomacy initiatives of our State Department colleagues. fully moving ahead in terms of, a key message that when we're going to contest in cyberspace, we're going to do that consistent with norms of responsible state behavior. The idea is that when someone breaks one of those norms, there needs to be consequences. And those consequences can't just be the strongly worded letter, right? There needs to be some other things that go with that. And our activity of contesting further strengthens those norms and promotes stability and security in our view. And that's how we work hand in hand together with our state colleagues.
And there's just a huge change afoot. I'll use you as an example, and you and I have talked about this. So Josh and I grew up in the same warfare community in the Navy, the cryptologic warfare community. We're called special duty officers, not real line officers, right, Josh?
Yeah, we weren't really in the Navy. That's right.
We're really in the Navy. But if you take a fellowship like Josh is in at Atlantic Council and several others, an intelligence officer would not have been considered for a job like this 5 years ago. When you look at the lightning way in which the cyber warfare program at the Naval Academy has taken off, it has gone from a conversation that I had with Dean Phillips, I think in the spring of 2011, to the most popular major at the Naval Academy today, and it crosses every warfare community. So there are pilots, there are SEALs, there are submariners, there are surface guys, and there are cryptologic warfare officers in that. And the same can be said for both Colorado Springs and West Point for there. So I think there's a huge change afoot that makes me very optimistic that this is going to grow from the ground up, if nothing else, inside of DoD and our government.
Yeah, I really like both of those answers, and especially diplomacy is going to be especially important under the new strategy. Because a lot of the stuff we're pivoting through is going to be systems that aren't owned by the United States, and that might ruffle feathers, and we're going to need diplomats on one hand to be there to make that better. But also, so much of the argument of how things get better is built around this argument of tacit bargaining. That in this back and forth of these militaries bumping into each other, right? I mean, and us following Russians or Iranians or North Koreans or Chinese, and occasionally trying to disrupt their operations and following them through, that's supposed to make things better. Like, through that process, things are going to get better. But we know, it reminds me of Rick Ledgett, the former deputy NSA, who once called one of these operations, it was hand-to-hand fighting, right? And hand-to-hand fighting isn't known for saying, all right, yep, I respect that I went too far, let me pull back a little bit, right? It's the kind of thing that encourages everyone involved to do more, right? So what's the tap out, right? If we're saying, no, this is too much, this is really starting to piss us off, and things are going to get worse, we don't have hotlines with most of these countries. If we do, it's at a very high level. There's very little mill-to-mill contact. And so that conversation of you have just done too much might happen within the networks themselves between the forces. Reminds me of a line from Stuart Baker, one of our colleagues, former undersecretary at DHS, who said, we need to be proportional plus a little bit. And so I think that role of the diplomat to be there as part of that tacit bargaining conversation, so that it's not all happening between mill-to-mill contact in other people's networks.
I want to make sure we get enough time for Q&A with the audience. So rules of engagement here. So just, if you can, give us your name, who you're affiliated with. Maybe keep it to one question and keep it brief so we can get through. We have two folks here from the council with some microphones. They're going to bring them to you. So why don't we start right here? Yep, you got it. And then we'll go right to you.
Yep.
Hi, Claudia Farris, Catalyst Institute for Applied Policy. Question, Madeline, do raised comments mean that your status review does not include the capabilities, capacities, and contributions of the private sector? Sorry to break the rule, but the second one is, before I heard the rule, Ray. Several people commented about the fact that you can't predict what your adversary is going to do. You said we are going to have shared resources. I heard that Russians are already talking about establishing a focused, wholly owned network, internet system. If everybody does that, where does that place us, having postured ourselves of having shared resources?
Yeah, great, thanks.
You want to start with the first one? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So I think I understood your question was, did the cyber posture review incorporate the assets of the private sector? Include them in the strategy. So with regard to the strategy looks at the private sector as part of what we are required to defend. And so one of the key objectives of so no, not insofar as it is based on what forces, capabilities, posture the Department of Defense has. So insofar as we can contract for support or services, but it's about what DoD can bring to this mission set.
And it does, and it is in the strategy, right? I mean, it is there, the partnership, the outreach, DoD Cyber Command starting to pass things to virus total, right? I mean, you are seeing some difference in that persistent partnership.
Absolutely,
right? Yeah.
absolutely.
And on the, it's great you brought up, it was great reporting probably 2 weeks ago now that Russia did an exercise to say basically, can we have an entirely Russian internet? Iran tried to do this with halal internet a while back. It's even more than the Great Firewall of China, because it's trying to say, we want to make it so we're not routable to external space. It's getting into things like root DNS servers and geekdom, but it is quite interesting, right? The American view, the internet itself was invented to ignore borders, to ignore hierarchy. It took these really liberal values and it baked it in to the domain. And what the Russians are saying was, we're not happy with that deal. Oh, it baked in a lot of insecurity too. But the Russians are saying, we're not happy with that liberal deal. We want to get the internet, but we don't want to accept this lack of hierarchy, this kind of open trust, this lack of sovereignty within our own space. And we can't do that if some of our content's being routed out of the country, if we have a globally routable internet. And so this is getting to the point, right? The American system has been based on, we still want this maximalist view, that there are essentially no borders in cyberspace, that it will be safe, resilient, secure, open, and we can do this other stuff that we want to do. It gets to political philosophy. We want the best of all possible worlds in this. And it might be at the point, and I've been fully on with that, we're getting to the point where we might have to say, we're not going to get the best of all possible worlds anymore. We need to avoid the worst. And our goal needs to be, say, internet's gone off the rails, cyberspace is never going to be more open, free, and secure than what we have today. Our kids are going to inherit something that's far worse. Let's try and give them the best that we can, rather than the best that we understand it now. And I think that totally fits in with that. It totally fits in with GDPR. It fits in with a whole broad set of digital. It fits in with social media. It fits in with all of these things that are all going in the wrong direction, or many of them off in the wrong direction. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you. Right here, and then we'll go right there.
Thank you very much, Peter. Michael Nielsen from the Danish Embassy. All of you talked about the role of allies. Madeleine mentioned the offensive cyber capabilities that you had contributed at NATO. We have offered the same. Admiral Leyen mentioned issues with the FMS cases. So you also suggested that more needs to be done in this area. And could I maybe invite you to talk a little bit more about what needs to be done in relation to working with allies and where allies might also contribute? Thank you.
How do you want to take a stab at that one from the FMS perspective?
I'm kind of passionate about this, so I think it's a great question. It starts with my current position being asked by an ally to help them do a cybersecurity assessment on a Raytheon system on a contract that we were already on, and what I got back from the DSCA, the group that kind of monitors arms exports, is it'll take you a long time to get permission to do that. And it was pretty disheartening for me an ally as a naval officer that I couldn't, easily to have any kind of conversation, whether I was doing it from an intelligence point of view, which I spent most of my career as, or as anything. And then when I looked at this more and more from the perspective, I found that the systems that we are depending on in our alliances, really there's no good way to look at cybersecurity there. We tend to think about the value and what it does, I think, and this is kind of where I would come back to my opinion perhaps a little bit, the value of what it does and how it might reduce the cost of a system that gets sold as part of an FMS case, but we really don't look at it from a broad perspective. General Nakasoni's testimony did say the first FMS case for cyber was last year. I guess I wink when I also read the next line to a Five Eyes country. That tells me we really are just sticking our toe in this. So I think this needs a lot of work. I think it needs a pull from our allies, sir, as much as it needs a push from our side. But there's shared risk, and I think that we have to recognize that, and we have to treat it the same way that we treat risk in every other warfighting domain.
So let's go there. I'm going to call two questions.
I think we had to, yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead. No, please.
throw it
Sorry.
on? I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead, please.
I also,
Yeah.
this is really important to us
Yeah.
at the department, and particularly at the department level. And I know we've talked about this in the past. So very broadly, we have 5 objectives of what we want to be able to accomplish in and through cyberspace for the Department of Defense. And we want to do that, as we do all of the other missions of the Department of Defense, with partners. We're working out how we do that. And so part of that is building that security cooperation framework, tapping into the DoD Title 10, as well as the State Department Title 22, security assistance, resources and capabilities, figuring out how we use those tools to build partner capacity, as well as to do that traditional exchange of goods. We have standing agreements, the AXA cross-servicing agreements. Does that apply to cyber tools? Don't know. We got to figure out. Question is always, it depends. And so it's finding those use cases to push it through. But in terms of what we want to do with partners, we want to do everything that we are doing today and everything that we're doing in the cyber environment. We want to get to that place with our partners that we're doing those things together, because cyber is a domain of warfare, a domain of operations, and we operate. One of our strategic advantages is our allies and partners, and we cannot allow that strategic advantage to be denied to us in a key domain of operations going forward.
That's a great point. When you look back at Estonia, which I featured in my book, Estonia won in 2007 when they were attacking, and they were won largely because of soft power, because they had friends and allies that they were able to turn to. And we don't think of that soft power of friends and allies as making a difference in cyber conflict, but it was absolutely what made the difference for Estonia in 2007. I love what Tom Bossert and Rob Joyce did in working together with the allies and calling out WannaCry and NotPetya, of saying, this is what we mean by not following norms. And getting a lot of countries together and say, Russia did this, North Korea did this, and this is what we mean. This is what they do, which is not what we do. And it was really, really critical. And there's one last thing we could do with allies, is an Article 4 with NATO. Most of us know NATO Article 5, collective defense. Article 4 is a consultation when there's a threat to security or political sovereignty. And that's what we're seeing from Russia. I've been arguing it a couple of years. Thomas Silvas and I had a piece out 2 years ago in the FT. It doesn't require anyone to do anything, but it gets the allies together and says that what is happening from Russia to our elections is intolerable to Western democracies, and let's get together and discuss it.
Yeah, great.
Thank
Here,
you.
and then we'll go here.
Hello, my name is Kamal Thomas. I'm with the Carnegie Endowment. My question is, when we look at how the U.S. organizes its interactions with the private sector, is the current existing model of voluntary sector-based public-private partnerships sufficient to address cyber threats in the coming decades, or do we need to bring new mechanisms and collaborative tools to bear, such as things like Project Indigo, that would shrink the gap between the public and private sector on a lot of these issues?
Jay, you want to take all that one?
Yeah, thanks. And by the way, if folks don't know the work from Kamal and others at the Carnegie Endowment, they're doing great work on cyber and finance. So they really got great work on that. Yeah, we had a paper that came out, myself and one of my former students, and we're saying, let's look at new concepts, right? A lot of time we end up in defense support to civil authorities, which is kind of how DoD might help DHS, but that's not necessarily the model here. And maybe we consider defense support to the private sector, and what might be different if we click ourselves into that new way of thinking. For example, maybe you need a joint force headquarters or a joint task force that is just there to provide support to the private sector. Briefly, I was the liaison between the joint cyber force at the fight, JTF CNO, and the finance sector and the FSISAC. If today, at the end of the day, the private sector was going to say, we're not going to be able to close, we're going to have a massive incident unless these 5 targets can be taken down. How do we get that information from the finance sector to the right teams who can do something about it? And so I think there's a lot that we can do, and we spell that out in that paper. We might even need, right? The Army decided that they needed a civil affairs officer in an MOS to say, you know what, working within the human training, working with people is so critical, we need someone like that. Well, if so much of the fight is in the private sector, they're the FIBA, the forward edge of the battle area, maybe we need officers that are trained in particular to deal with them. Cyber Command is never going to have the common operational picture that they want, because so much of it is in the private sector. So does that common operational picture need to be at Cyber Command? Or can it be somewhere else based on private sector resources, and the Cyber Command sits at that private sector center rather than the other way around?
Yeah, actually, I was going to piggyback on the question, is that to what extent then, I guess for you, Madeline, to what extent do you think this is the success of the implementation kind of hinge upon coordination and cooperation or willingness of the private sector to kind of come on board and help with the vision?
So I think we need to recognize that there are 2 different sets of responsibilities with the private sector. So first and foremost, there are those who provide goods and services to the Department of Defense, and increasingly we are inserting contractual obligations that require them to meet certain standards, to reveal when they have been compromised, to cooperate with us in those instances. And I think that is a feature of the landscape going forward. If you are working with the Department of Defense, we are going to expect that you are going to be defending yourself to a certain standard, and when something happens, you are going to work with us so we can understand the impact on us. So I want to distinguish between voluntary and required cooperation, because that's an important distinction. In terms of the voluntary,
Are they charging you more for that? Are they saying we'll live up to these standards, but it's going to cost you X amount on top? Oh, I'm sorry. He's right there. Awkward.
Let me deal with that, because it is something I think when you look at it from the defense, the aerospace and defense industry perspective. I mean, we take cybersecurity extraordinarily serious. I think there have been some. One in particular from the Navy this fall that talked about how that flows down through all the subs. It is a hard problem, and if a small company that's doing some thinking or design work, that's a 4-person company, to demand that they do all of the NIST 800 pieces with that is maybe burdensome to both the big company and the small company, and we've got to work through that. I don't think there's been a discussion about charging that, but I can only imagine that as we get mature in that it's either already built into overhead just for the IT services, and we're already defending ourselves, or the more rules that get put on, they'll clearly be a response.
And I'm sorry, I cut you off on your
That's
second
okay.
point
So
as well.
I think I just want to say that from the department's perspective, we understand that this is a hard problem to solve and we want to work together, but I think Secretary Shanahan has said it very clearly that the department isn't going to pay extra for a product to be delivered compromised, right? That's the whole idea of deliver uncompromised. We expect that one of the attributes of delivering a quality product is that product is not riddled with vulnerabilities and or already compromised. So that's on the one point. I think I'm afraid on the private sector. We also have a lot of interest from the private sector today. And I mentioned earlier Pathfinder projects. Although you had talked about working directly between DoD and the private sector, while we do that in some instances, we have some good cooperation with DHS who has that as their primary role. And that's a feature of the MOU between Secretary of Defense and Secretary of DHS, is articulating how we need some of that information in order to better enable us to do our job outside of the United States from those private sector partners. Meanwhile, our private sector partners in DHS can do a better job at their missions and their roles of protecting domestically, informed by insights from our operations outside. So in the greatness of Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, put our peanut butter and their chocolate together and you get something better than the individual parts. And so by bringing everybody together, we're moving in a better direction rather than pushing someone out of the way and picking up extra mission that we may not have the authority, the experience, the wherewithal to do. But instead doing it with DHS, where we focus on what we do, they focus on what they do, and the private sector focuses on what they do, but doing it together. That's better.
And for you millennials, that was a commercial in the
I'm not endorsing any
yeah.
Reese's products, just to be clear.
I think the other piece of this, Josh, is this notion of great power competition is going to spawn some fascinating conversations. Who here could imagine nationalizing Verizon the way that we nationalized Ford Motor Company to make aircraft in World War II? But if we're really serious about the importance of the internet and information age technologies to the fundamental fabric of our nation, our economy, it's not a far-fetched question to ask when you get to a great power competition discussion.
But to do that, we would have to declare a national emergency. So.
All right, I'm going to come here. I think we got time for about 5 minutes left. So we'll about 2 more years. We'll come here, and then you had your head just for a while.
Hi, Shannon Welch, Daniel Morgan Graduate School. The security strategy talked a lot about infrastructure and international and private partnerships, but I'm particularly interested in partnerships with local law enforcement, especially when it comes to infrastructure. I'm from Las Vegas originally, and so we have a large infrastructure, the Hoover Dam. There's a lot of roundtables with local law enforcement about things like terrorist operations that can happen there, but not anything that has to do with cyber. There was a cyber attack against the electrical grid, which would have a huge effect on the area of Nevada, Arizona, California. So what is kind of the effect of this security strategy for local law enforcement and the government?
Yeah, that's a good question. How far down does this strategy go? Admiral, you want to start?
My sense is from reading the national strategy, not nearly far enough, and nor do I recall reading anything recently. I go back to the University of Maine where I graduated from and have helped them try to stand up and bootstrap a cyber program. And what do you do in a predominantly rural state to make cyber stand out and have a valid curriculum that's got the DHS, NSA, stamp of approval curricula? And it was really, really hard to do. But when we started looking for things, you get to a much smaller scale than the Hoover Dam. When you looked, and this was a couple of years ago, the biggest cyber threat in Maine was ransomware attacks to the individual town level. And there's not a town manager or its board of selectmen in Maine that would know how to deal with that. And I think there's got to be, some different view of what cyber first response means in a way that's scalable to the needs of local municipalities, all the way from a very prominent facility to a small town being the victim of a ransomware attack. What worried me from a Navy perspective, if I go back, and this is something that I hope gets worked on more. I had a very nascent Navy force, and knowing that in the time of a national emergency, DHS had no capacity, even though it was their mission, and those sailors were going to be called to be able to do that. And I don't know where that gap is between the cyber mission force and a few professionals that likely would come from industry, and the ability to be that first responder or force that goes to reconstruct something. I think it's a big problem that we're probably only going to learn by experience. Is my worry.
And I'm trying to call it all my think tank colleagues here. New America has done great work on that. Natasha Cohen, who is actually here in the room, did a lot on looking through the state and local and what programs are there and what's best practice and what DHS and other federal government organizations might do. And so they I think have done the most interesting work and continue to do great interesting work at New America.
And not everything is captured in the national strategy. A lot of the work that we had done over previous years related to domestic cyber incident response in PPD 41 continues to stand, where it articulates domestic roles and responsibilities, with the FBI having the threat response and our DHS colleagues having the entity response responsibilities. And what's happened since that document was published in the summer of 2016 is we've refined underneath that broad framework how different departments and agencies have assets to contribute to that state and local level issues would contribute in meaningful ways. And we saw with the recent midterm elections, DoD actually had in place, moving forward on this defense support to civil authorities, we'd worked very closely with DHS to have in place a pre-approved agreement that if they did need help, this is what we could easily provide. That authority had been delegated. We were ready, if required, if asked, to help make things happen.
All right. This will be the last question here. I think we're bumping up on time. So.
Hi, my name is Benjamin Weil. Up until recently, I was the international advisor to the Israeli Minister of Energy. And one of the issues I worked on with the Secretary of Energy here in the US and other countries was critical infrastructure and cybersecurity on that infrastructure. And one of the things we identified is that there is that national threat from countries, but there's also terrorist organizations and private actors where sometimes it's a matter of time until we start seeing them joining this arena. And you've spoken about the diplomacy of cybersecurity and the mutual assured destruction approach of kind of hijacking each other's electric grid. I was wondering what strategies or what tactics are addressed specifically to tackle the private actor and terrorist cyber capabilities.
Yeah, Jay, I mean, strategies, is it scoped so we can look at non-state or?
Well, I mean, certainly on the terrorist side, right? I mean, I think a lot of what was driving, where we know most about what Cyber Command has done is what has been said publicly about JTF Ares. Michael Martel from the National Security Archives has got a ton of material on what the U.S. has been doing against. I really am trying to call everyone out here. They've got great stuff, even the actual order, the execution orders. General Nakasone has been quite clear in calling out countries where we expected Cyber Command to be going after terrorists: Syria, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq. No surprise, that's where ISIS is. But he was listing like Philippines was in there, and I think a lot of us were like, "Wow, really? We didn't know that." So without a doubt, that's included, and that is the official offensive cyber operations. If you see DoD saying offensive cyber operations, that's the kind of thing they mean. And so they've gotten very good at that, or they seem to be doing better at that, getting involved in disrupting their capabilities to recruit, to fundraise, to communicate. And I think obviously if they saw plots against the electrical grid, that would be they probably have the existing authority to go after that. I don't even know if they'd have to go back to the White House and say, hey, can we please hit this? I think they could probably just go hit it or close to it. Great.
I think when you look at the statement of policy that both in the national cyber strategy and in the defense cyber strategy, it clearly says that our objective is to prevent an attack of significant consequence on critical infrastructure. While the rest of the document talks about the big four, our big four adversary sets and violent extremists to a lesser extent, the protecting against an attack of significant consequence on critical infrastructure is agnostic to the actor. That is exactly as Jay said. That's something that we see as kind of a big part of the mission set for the department.
Anybody want to comment on that?
I think good progress is being made. General Nakasone did call these partnerships out in his testimony. I think that's an example that shows that it's clearly on his mind. I think with what I'm seeing in industry right now, there's a lot more partnerships being developed between critical sectors of our economy and to protect themselves better. I think there's that recognition that they have to be the first line of defense, not just on the IT side, but on the operational technology side as well. So I'm fairly optimistic here. I think if it's connected, it's vulnerable. I think anyone that's a cyber professional would kind of takes that deep breath with any of these things. But there's progress being made here, I think, and there's an opportunity, perhaps more so than some of our older practices with IT security on the OT side, to make some progress here. So I'm optimistic all in all, both from a nation-state perspective and the impact that would have from lone actors or terrorists.
Well, on behalf of the Atlantic Council and specifically the cyber statecraft initiatives, I want to thank all three of you for being here and providing that insight. Really wonderful. Really helped us out a lot. And thank you all for coming. And thank you all for coming.